They called it garbage. He called it opportunity. The old pickup rattled over the wooden bridge just as the church bell struck 7. Most people in Maple Creek knew exactly where it was headed. Look, a teenager laughed from outside the diner, nudging his friend. There goes old Elias again. The boys watched the faded green truck disappear around the corner, pulling a rusty trailer that looked as though it should have fallen apart years ago. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the truck. It was what Elias Turner loaded onto it. Not furniture, not lumber, not tools. Garbage. At least, that's what the town called it. Every Wednesday morning, Elias stopped at the same places: a cabinet maker on Willow Street, a family-owned flooring shop beside the railway tracks, and an old sawmill at the edge of town. By noon, his trailer overflowed with bags of sawdust, curlywood shavings, bark, broken pallets, and splintered scraps no one else wanted. "You're doing the town's cleaning for free," the cabinet maker joked as he dragged another sack toward the trailer. Elias smiled and tightened the rope holding the load in place. "No," he replied. "I'm collecting tomorrow." The cabinet maker laughed so hard he nearly dropped the bag. "Tomorrow? That's pine dust. It used to be a tree. So everything that came from life can help create life again." The man shook his head with a grin. "You've always been different, Elias." "I'll take that as a compliment." As the truck rolled away, the cabinet maker watched until it disappeared behind the hills. "What a strange old man," he muttered. He had no idea those worthless bags would one day become more valuable than the hardwood furniture he spent his life building. Long before people called him eccentric, Elias had been known for something else. His hands. They were the hands of a master carpenter. Wide, scarred, and strong enough to lift heavy oak beams, yet gentle enough to carve delicate flowers into a cedar rocking chair. People drove for hours just to have him build a dining table or restore an antique wardrobe. He never rushed a job. "If a tree spent 50 years growing," he often said, "the least I can do is give it my full attention." It was a lesson he had learned from his grandfather, Walter Turner. Walter had never gone to university. He couldn't explain soil chemistry or plant biology. But he understood the forest better than anyone Elias had ever known. When Elias was only 9 years old, Walter would take him deep into the woods carrying nothing but an axe, a canvas satchel, and an old leather notebook with cracked corners. They rarely spoke. Instead, Walter pointed. A fallen tree covered in moss. A rotting log alive with tiny mushrooms. Dark earth filled with earthworms. Leaves slowly disappearing beneath the forest floor. Finally, he would ask the same question. "What do you see?" Young Elias usually answered with whatever was obvious. "A dead tree. Mushrooms. Leaves." Walter would smile patiently. "No." Then he'd kneel, scoop up a handful of rich black soil, and let it fall slowly through his fingers. "I see tomorrow." At first, Elias never understood. How could a dead tree become tomorrow? Years later, Walter finally explained. The forest never throws anything away. He looked toward the towering pines swaying gently in the breeze. Every branch that falls feeds the soil. Every leaf becomes food for something. Every tree that dies gives life to another. He closed the notebook and handed it to Elias. "Remember this, boy." Elias opened the worn pages. Inside were sketches of trees, rainfall notes, simple drawings of roots, and one sentence written over and over in careful handwriting. "Nature has no garbage." Walter rested a weathered hand on his grandson's shoulder. "People think they're smarter than the forest." He smiled softly. "The forest has been farming for millions of years." Those words never left Elias. Even after Walter passed away. Even after the notebook became the only thing he had left of his grandfather. Even after life became too busy to think about forests. Years later, Elias married Ruth, opened his own carpentry workshop, and built a quiet life doing what he loved. Business was good. But every evening, after sweeping the workshop floor, he paused beside the growing pile of sawdust. The others swept theirs into dumpsters. Elias couldn't. He remembered the notebook. He remembered the forest. He remembered his grandfather's voice. Nature has no garbage. So instead of throwing it away, he carried the sawdust home. One bag became 5. 5 became 20. Soon, a corner of the old barn was filled with neatly stacked sacks. Ruth stood in the doorway one evening, folded her arms, and laughed. "Elias." He looked up from tying another sack. "Yes." "Should I be worried?" He smiled. "Not unless the sawdust starts asking for dinner." She shook her head. I married the only carpenter in the county who treats wood shavings like treasure. He walked over and kissed her forehead. Maybe they are. She looked at the growing stacks inside the barn. I hope you know something the rest of us don't. Elias glanced toward the open fields behind the house. I don't know it yet. He paused. But I intend to find out. Elias intended to find out, even if it took the rest of his life. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the hills, he carried one of the sacks behind the barn. A narrow strip of ground separated the vegetable garden from an old maple tree. Nothing had grown well there for years. The soil was pale, dry, and packed so tightly that even after a rainstorm it cracked like old pottery. He knelt and pressed his fingers into the earth. Still hard, he murmured. Ruth stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She watched him from a distance before walking over. You've been staring at that patch for 3 days. It's the worst soil on the property. So, he accepted the mug with a grateful smile. If I can bring this ground back to life, the rest of the farm might not be impossible. Ruth looked at the sack beside him. And this is your miracle? No. He laughed softly. This is just one piece of it. For the next several weeks, Elias worked every spare hour behind the barn. He mixed the sawdust with fallen leaves gathered from the lane, grass clippings from the yard, and manure from a neighboring dairy farmer who was happy to give it away. Old Mr. Henderson leaned over the fence one afternoon, watching Elias turn the growing pile with a pitchfork. What in heaven's name are you making? I'm not sure yet. The old farmer chuckled. That's a dangerous answer. I know what I'm hoping for. And what's that? Elias rested both hands on the wooden handle. Living soil. Mr. Henderson scratched his gray beard. Soil's soil. Elias smiled. No. He scooped up a handful of dry dirt from the nearby field and let it fall through his fingers. This is dirt. Then he pointed toward the forest beyond the pasture. That is soil. The old farmer followed his gaze. I don't understand. The forest grows without fertilizer, without tractors, without anyone plowing it every spring. Something beneath those trees has been doing the work long before we arrived. Mr. Henderson shook his head. You think too much. Maybe, but I think the forest has been trying to teach us something. The old farmer laughed as he walked away. If your pile starts talking back, let me know. Summer arrived with little rain. Day after day, the fields baked beneath a cloudless sky. Neighbors complained that their gardens were already struggling. The Brooks family, who farmed the next valley over, had begun hauling water every evening just to keep their tomatoes alive. Even Ruth worried. If this weather keeps up, we're going to lose half the garden. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the compost pile. Something had changed. When he pushed the pitchfork inside, warm steam drifted into the cool morning air. He frowned. The pile was warm. Warmer than it should have been. Curious, he buried his hand deeper. Heat surrounded his fingers. Not the heat of the sun. A different kind. The kind that came from something happening inside. That evening, he opened Walter's notebook again. Most pages contained sketches of trees and weather notes, but tucked inside the back cover was a folded piece of paper he had never noticed before. It was yellow with age. Across the top, in Walter's neat handwriting, were the words, "Feed the tiny workers, and they'll feed the land." There were no further explanations. Just a simple drawing of leaves, wood, and manure piled together beneath a tree. Elias stared at it for several minutes. He remembered something Walter had once said while turning over a rotting log. The smallest workers often do the biggest jobs. Back then, Elias had thought he meant ants. Now he wasn't so sure. The following Saturday, Elias drove nearly 50 miles to attend a gardening fair in the neighboring county. Most visitors crowded around displays of shiny tractors and new equipment. Elias wandered somewhere else. Near the back of the exhibition hall sat a modest table covered with jars of compost, earthworms, and samples of dark, crumbly soil. An elderly woman wearing a name tag that read Dr. Miriam Hale, soil ecologist, noticed him studying the display. "You've got questions," she said with a smile. "I always do." She picked up 2 glass jars. One held dry, pale dirt. The other contained rich black soil alive with tiny roots. "Which one would you rather plant in?" "The darker one." "Why?" "It looks alive." She smiled. "Exactly." For nearly an hour they talked. Not about fertilizer. Not about bigger machines. They talked about fungi that connected roots beneath the ground, bacteria that unlocked nutrients, and earthworms that quietly transformed dead material into fertile soil. Before Elias left, Dr. Hale handed him a small notebook. Inside the cover, she wrote one sentence. The goal isn't to feed the plant. The goal is to feed the soil, and the soil will feed the plant. Elias thanked her, tucked the notebook beside his grandfather's, and began the long drive home. As the truck climbed the final hill overlooking Maple Creek, he slowed to a stop. From there he could see his little farm stretched across the valley. The vegetable garden, the weathered barn, the old maple tree, and beside it, the compost pile. For the first time, he no longer saw a pile of wood waste. He saw the beginning of something that might change everything. He saw the beginning of something that might change everything. The next morning, Elias woke before dawn. He wasn't thinking about breakfast or the long list of carpentry jobs waiting in his workshop. His mind was fixed on the compost pile. A cool mist hung over the fields as he walked behind the barn, carrying both notebooks beneath one arm. The grass was wet with dew, and the only sounds were birds greeting the sunrise and the distant lowing of cattle from a neighboring farm. He knelt beside the pile and gently pulled it apart with a garden fork. Steam drifted upward into the chilly air. Not as much as before, but enough to tell him the pile was still alive. He smiled. "You're working," he whispered. Ruth, watching from the kitchen window, couldn't help but shake her head. "You've started talking to compost now," she teased when he came inside. Elias laughed. "I suppose I have." "And what did it say back?" "Nothing." He poured himself a cup of coffee. "But it's doing exactly what I hoped." She studied his face. It had been a long time since she'd seen that look, the quiet excitement that appeared whenever he was building something special in his workshop. Only this time, he wasn't building furniture. He was building hope. The months passed with the steady rhythm only country life could understand. By day, Elias repaired cabinets, built porch swings, and restored old dining tables. By evening, he returned to the pile behind the barn. Every few weeks, he added another layer. Wood shavings from the cabinet shop, horse manure from the Miller family stable, autumn leaves gathered from roadside ditches, kitchen scraps that Ruth carefully saved in a covered bucket. Nothing was wasted anymore. Everything had a purpose. The neighbors noticed. One afternoon, 3 men leaned against the fence while Elias unloaded another trailer of sawdust. "How much are they paying you?" one of them asked. "They're not. You haul all that for free." "I do." The tallest man laughed. "You know they'll dump it somewhere else if you stop taking it." "I know. So why bother?" Elias rested both hands on the trailer gate. "Because one day this won't be waste anymore." The men exchanged amused glances. One of them chuckled. "You've spent too many years breathing sawdust." Their laughter followed him as he drove toward the barn. Elias didn't take offense. He had learned something important from carpentry. Not everyone could recognize a finished table while it was still a rough plank. Winter arrived early that year. Heavy snow blanketed the fields, hiding every fence post and footpath beneath a thick white layer. The compost pile sat quietly under its covering of snow. To anyone passing by, it looked abandoned. But Elias knew better. One freezing January morning, he brushed away the snow and pushed a metal rod into the center. When he pulled it back out, the tip felt warm. He couldn't hide his smile. Even beneath ice and snow, life continued. That evening he opened Walter's notebook once again. Between 2 pages, something slipped onto the kitchen table. It was an old photograph. Walter stood beside a massive oak tree, no older than Elias was now. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "The greatest builders are the ones no one ever sees." Elias stared at the sentence for several minutes. Then he looked out the window toward the sleeping fields. He finally understood. His grandfather had never been talking about people. He had been talking about the billions of tiny organisms hidden beneath every healthy field. The builders no one ever thanked. The workers no one ever noticed. Yet without them, no harvest was possible. When spring finally returned, the snow melted into the earth. Ruth planted lettuce, carrots, onions, and tomatoes in the family garden as she did every year. But this time, Elias asked her to leave one section untouched. "The patch beside the maple?" she asked. He nodded. "I think it's ready." Ready. It was an unusual word for a patch of ground that had produced almost nothing for years. Together they spread the dark, crumbly compost over the lifeless soil. It no longer resembled sawdust. It smelled like the forest after rain. Rich, earthy, alive. Elias worked it gently into the ground before planting a row of tomato seedlings. Then they waited. Days turned into weeks. Green shoots appeared across the garden. At first, everything looked normal. Then Ruth noticed something. Elias. He looked up from repairing a gate. Come here. She stood beside the old maple tree. The tomato plants growing in the restored soil were taller. Their leaves were darker. Their stems were thicker than every other row. By midsummer, the difference was impossible to ignore. While neighboring gardens struggled through another dry spell, the little patch beside the maple remained deep green. Its soil stayed cool and moist long after the surrounding ground had dried. Ruth bent down and pushed her fingers into the earth. I've never felt soil like this, she whispered. Elias didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket, removed his grandfather's notebook, and wrote only 5 words beneath the day's date. The land is answering back. He closed the notebook slowly. For years, people had laughed at the piles behind his barn. Now, for the first time, the land itself was beginning to tell his story. Word spread quietly at first. Not through newspapers, not through meetings at the town hall, but the way most news travels in farming communities, across fence lines, over feed store counters, and during conversations that began with weather and ended with curiosity. Have you seen Elias's tomatoes? They're growing like they're in a different county. I heard he hasn't watered them half as much. It's probably just luck. Luck. Elias smiled whenever he heard the word. People often called years of patient work luck because they hadn't witnessed the years before success. He wasn't interested in proving anyone wrong. He simply kept working. One Saturday morning, a young farmer named Noah Bennett pulled into Elias's driveway. Noah had recently inherited 30 acres from his parents. He had enthusiasm, but very little experience. He climbed out of his truck holding his hat nervously. Mr. Turner? Elias looked up from sharpening a shovel. Morning. I hope I'm not bothering you. Not at all. Noah glanced toward the compost yard. I've heard stories. Elias laughed. I imagine you have. They say you figured out how to make dead ground grow again. I wouldn't put it quite like that. So, what's the secret? Elias leaned the shovel against the barn wall. There isn't one. There has to be. No. He began walking toward the vegetable garden, and Noah followed. The land isn't a machine. They stopped beside the flourishing tomatoes. You can't force it to produce. So what do? You help it recover. Noah frowned. I don't understand. Elias knelt and gently brushed aside the mulch. What happens if a man works every hour of every day without food or rest? He gets sick, and eventually, he stops working. Elias nodded. We've expected our soil to work for us year after year while giving very little back. He picked up a handful of dark earth. This isn't dirt. It's a community. Noah looked puzzled. A community? Bacteria, fungi, earthworms, beetles, roots. Thousands of living things working together. He smiled. My job isn't to replace them. It's to help them do theirs. Noah stood quietly for several moments. Then he asked the question Elias had once asked his own grandfather. Where do I begin? Elias looked toward the compost pile. With patience. As summer faded into autumn, more people visited. Some came out of genuine curiosity. Others came hoping to prove Elias wrong. One afternoon, a local council member arrived wearing polished boots that collected mud with every step. I've had complaints. About what? The piles behind your barn. Elias nodded calmly. I assumed I would. They say they're an eyesore. They're entitled to their opinion. The council member unfolded a clipboard. There are also concerns about odor. Elias smiled. Walk with me. They crossed the yard toward the compost windrows. Instead of a foul smell, the air carried the scent of damp earth after rain. The councilman stopped. This isn't what I expected. Elias pushed a fork into one pile and turned it over. Steam drifted into the cool afternoon air. You smell that? The man inhaled deeply. It smells like the woods. Exactly. No chemicals. None. No burning. No. The councilman looked around. I've inspected landfills that smelled worse than this. Elias chuckled. Because this isn't waste. He scooped up a handful of finished compost. It's food. For the soil. The councilman left without issuing a warning. 3 weeks later, the complaints quietly disappeared. Winter brought another challenge. An unusually violent windstorm swept through Maple Creek, toppling trees and damaging several barns. The following morning, chainsaws echoed across the valley. By afternoon, the roadsides were lined with broken branches, chipped trunks, and mountains of wood debris waiting to be hauled away. Most people saw destruction. Elias saw opportunity. He spent the next week helping neighbors clear their properties. Whenever someone thanked him, he asked only one question. What are you doing with the wood chips? Most shrugged, taking them to the dump. I'll take them. Before long, his yard filled with fresh piles of chipped branches. Ruth walked outside, folded her arms, and laughed. I should have guessed. What? You'd somehow find treasure in a storm. Elias grinned. The trees have one last gift to give. She shook her head affectionately. I've stopped trying to predict you. That evening, as snow began falling again, Ruth stood beside him looking over the growing rows of compost. You know, she said softly, I used to think you were collecting scraps because you hated wasting things. And now, she slipped her hand into his. I think you're collecting hope. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Across the fields, the first snow covered the earth in white. Beneath that blanket, billions of unseen organisms rested, waiting for spring. And beside the barn stood mountains of wood that everyone else had abandoned. Elias smiled to himself. The town still saw piles of garbage. He was beginning to see forests, gardens, harvests, and a future that was only just taking root. The following spring arrived with more rain than anyone could remember. Creeks spilled over their banks, tractors sank into muddy fields, and many farmers struggled to plant on time. When the skies finally cleared, the county burst into life. Fresh green shoots covered the hills. Wildflowers returned to the ditches. The forest shimmered in every shade of green. Elias stood quietly beside his compost yard, breathing in the cool morning air. The piles that had once towered above his head had become something entirely different. Rich, dark compost, soft enough to crumble between his fingers, alive with earthworms. He smiled. You're ready. Ruth stepped outside carrying a basket of seedlings. Talking to the compost again? He laughed. It keeps listening. She handed him the basket. Then let's see if it keeps its promises. Together, they spread wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of finished compost across an old field that had produced disappointing crops for nearly 15 years. The neighbors watched from the road. One whispered to another, He's putting half-rotted wood all over his field. Another shook his head. He's ruined that land. Elias heard every word. He simply kept working. By June, something unusual began to happen. The corn planted in the restored field emerged first. Its leaves were broader. Its color was deeper. Even after several hot weeks without rain, the plant stood upright while nearby fields began to curl under the heat. No one mentioned it publicly, but people noticed. Then came July. The county entered another dry spell. Day after day, temperatures climbed. Creeks shrank. Pastures turned pale. Garden hoses ran from dawn until dusk. One evening, Noah Bennett stopped by after checking his own fields. He stared across Elias's land in disbelief. I don't understand. What don't you understand? My field is cracking. He pointed toward the valley. Yours still looks like it rained yesterday. Elias walked into the corn and pushed his hand into the soil. Just below the surface, it was still cool. He scooped up a handful. It isn't magic. What is it? The soil is holding on to water instead of letting it run away. Noah looked across the rows. So all those years weren't about compost. No. Elias smiled. They were about building a sponge. Noah laughed. I've never heard anyone describe a field that way. Healthy soil acts like one. He squeezed the handful gently. When rain comes, it stores more of it. And during drought, it gives some back. Noah stood silently for a long time. Finally, he said the words Elias never expected to hear. I think I owe you an apology. For what? I called you the woodpile farmer. Elias chuckled. I know. I told people you were wasting your retirement. And now? Noah smiled sheepishly. Now I wish I'd started sooner. By autumn, the harvest confirmed what the fields had been quietly saying all season. The restored acreage produced the healthiest crop Elias had ever grown. The vegetables were larger. The corn was fuller. Even the orchard trees, which had struggled for years, carried heavier fruit. Ruth filled crate after crate for the Saturday farmers market. Customers noticed immediately. What are you feeding these tomatoes? One woman held up a tomato nearly the size of both hands. I've never seen one this beautiful. Ruth smiled. Healthy soil. The woman laughed. No, really. Ruth simply pointed toward Elias, who was unloading baskets from the truck. Him. As the months passed, People who had once laughed began arriving with trailers of their own. Some carried sawdust. Others brought leaves, horse manure, wood chips, coffee grounds from cafes, fruit scraps from grocery stores. "Can you use these?" they asked. Elias accepted every load with the same quiet smile. Before long, the old compost yard had grown into something much larger than a personal project. Neighbors gathered on Saturday mornings. Children helped turn compost piles with small garden forks. Retired farmers shared stories while stacking leaves. Local gardeners exchanged seeds and ideas. Without anyone planning it, a community had formed. One afternoon, Ruth stood watching the activity from the porch. "It's funny." "What is?" "You spent years trying to convince people that waste had value." Elias nodded. "And you never convinced them with words." "How did I convince them?" She looked across the bustling yard. "You waited until the land spoke for you." Elias looked toward the fields glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. His grandfather had been right. The greatest builders really were the ones no one ever saw. The fungi beneath the roots, the earthworms beneath the leaves, the microbes hidden inside every handful of soil. They had done what no argument ever could. They had turned doubt into belief. They had turned waste into abundance. And they had reminded an entire town that nature never hurries. Yet somehow, it always finishes its work. Years later, when visitors asked Elias Turner how he transformed worn-out land into fertile fields, he never talked about compost first. He would bend down, pick up a handful of rich, living soil, and let it trickle slowly through his fingers. Then he'd smile and say, "Most people spend their lives asking what they can take from the land. The better question is, what can you give back?" The visitors usually fell silent, because standing before them wasn't just a successful farm. It was living proof that patience could outlast ridicule, that wisdom could outgrow pride, and that what the world dismissed as garbage could become the foundation of new life. And every evening, before heading inside, Elias still carried the old leather notebook to the porch. Its pages were nearly full now. On the final page, beneath decades of observations, sketches, rainfall records, and quiet lessons, he wrote one last sentence. "The richest harvest I ever grew wasn't from the field. It was teaching others to see value where I once saw waste." He closed the notebook, looked across the golden fields one final time, and smiled. The land had kept its promise. Sheaf of rice field note: healthy soil is built, not bought. Every leaf, every branch, and every handful of compost returned to the earth is an investment in harvests yet to come. Nature wastes nothing, and neither should we. If Elias Turner's story inspired you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Modern Farm Life. Give this video a like, and share it with someone who believes every challenge hides an opportunity. Which part of Elias's journey stayed with you the most? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and remember, every great harvest begins with a seed, and every lasting legacy begins with the courage to plant it.